Welcome to the Lucas Rockwood Show. I am your host. I am a yoga teacher. I'm a trainer, nutritional coach, a serial entrepreneur. I'm a father. But first and foremost, I am a student. I love learning. This show is about scratching my own itch. I go out into the world, find medical doctors, yoga teachers, authors, experts, researchers, people doing interesting things, and I share their best research, their best teachings with you to hopefully help you live a better life. On this week's show, we're talking about memory. We're talking about cognition. Most people I speak to, when they talk about aging and getting on in their years, they're most worried about the engine under the hood, their brain slowing down. When it takes a couple of extra seconds to remember the name of your colleague, when you're doing some simple math equations at the grocery store and you can't seem to figure out how much change should be left over if something costs 57 cents. These kinds of senior moments, as they're often called, are something that all of us, of course, want to avoid. We've spoken to many people on the show about how diet and lifestyle can really influence your brain health, your neurological health, but we haven't chatted a lot about just the simple practice of using your brain, exercising that mental muscle. On this week's show, we'll be chatting with a memory expert, a world champion. Can count cards, can memorize a couple hundred names in one go. He climbed Mount Everest a bunch of times. He's got an Alzheimer's nonprofit. Just a really dynamic, unique individual who will hopefully shed some light and inspire you to get your brain moving again. Most people, after their secondary education, read like 2 books ever. So a lot of people really stop learning, and it's not so great for your lifestyle, and maybe it's not so great for your brain either. As always, your questions, comments, and feedback are most welcome. I'm now taking questions from my personal Instagram account. If you go to Lucas Rockwood, at Lucas Rockwood on Instagram, you can DM me and you can send an audio or a text message, and I will answer it here on the show, and maybe I'll answer right there in Instagram as well. Enjoy the show. So hello and welcome. It's Lucas Rockwood here. Today's show is called Improve Your Memory. I'm joined here by Nelson Dellis. Nelson's a 4-time USA memory champion. He's one of the leading memory experts in the world. He's a competitive memory athlete. Yes, that's a thing. We'll chat about this. A memory consultant. He's a published author. He's got a book called Remember It. He's a keynote speaker. He's a memory champion, a mountaineer, and he's also done a lot of work with Alzheimer's, and he actually has a nonprofit dedicated to Alzheimer's specifically. He's been featured all over the news on Fox, The Today Show, Fox and Friends, Katie Couric, and so many other shows. You can learn about his work at his website, which is nelsondellis.com. You can also find him by his name on YouTube, and of course, the book is on Amazon. Nelson, welcome to the show.
Hey, Lucas, thanks for having me.
I, like many people, have always made the excuse that I'm terrible with names. People say this all the time. I'm great with faces, but I'm terrible with names. And I'm a yoga teacher by trade. And a couple of years ago, well, probably 5-6 years ago, one of my colleagues said, "Hey, that's a totally dumb thing to say. Stop saying that. Like, just learn people's names." And you really put me in my place. And I realized how arrogant and how self-centered I was. I wasn't learning my own clients' names. And I've really made significant gains, and to the point where usually I'll have a course and we'll have anywhere from, like a big course for us might be 30 or 40 people. And usually the same day that the course starts, I can learn everyone's name. And it's been one of the better things that I've done for myself as a speaker and a leader and a teacher. It's so worth the time. I'll sit there and learn names. It'll take me 15 minutes or something like that. A little bit of reinforcement the next day too. And I use photos, and Facebook's really helpful now too. And while I'm definitely no memory expert, it's completely changed my connection with students, and it's not just superficial. It seemed like it didn't really matter. And I realized it really does matter. If you remember somebody's name, it's kind of foundational to who they are. If you remember where they're from, if you remember if they have kids, it really shows that you care. And so I just want to kick things off by starting with the fact that I always poo-pooed this idea of memory having value. And in my own life, in my own career, I've realized that, wow, this is really baseline. If you can't remember the names of the people you're working with, your clients, if you can't remember the names of their kids, you're kind of useless. And I put myself in that category for many, many years. How has this played out for you? Were you always a memory whiz, or how did it work?
Yeah, so I actually never had a phenomenal memory growing up. I'd be interested in certain things and maybe have a better memory for that. But overall, I think it's nothing to write home about. And then I started to kind of think about memory differently after I saw my grandmother struggle with Alzheimer's, and that led me to discover the U.S. Memory Championships. And when I realized how these competitors were doing insanely difficult things that seemed impossible for the average memory, but these people were average people. I was convinced that I could do it as well, and that's what kind of got me motivated to start working on my memory, just like you did, but on a competitive level.
And when people think about this stuff, they often think about the things that I know that you're great at too, like memorizing cards and memorizing names and strings of numbers and things like that. And I guess what happens, it's very similar to like hypnotherapy, where people think of stage shows and then they forget that there's a real utilitarian purpose to all this stuff too. And so I gave a very clear example how this has had an impact, very, very clear impact in my life. What other impacts do you see clients that you work with have in terms of improving their relationships or their work life or their ability to earn money or impact people?
Yeah, I mean, you hit it on the nose starting off the show saying how much of a difference something as small as remembering a name can be. And that's honestly one of the most frequently asked coaching requests I get is, can you help me with names because I want to learn all of my clients' names or the people I meet in meetings, just for these relationships that, they walk away, the person that you're interacting with a sense of, hey, this person actually cared or was paying attention to me. And people who don't remember people's names, it's not that they're not necessarily paying attention, but that doesn't matter. It's the perception on the other end. So a name is something so personal to that person. If you can remember that, it means a whole lot. So that's one of the most common things. But more in general, if you think about memory, it's something that everybody has and everybody uses. And especially now where we have devices that can help us replace memory, like our smartphones, you feel like you don't really need your memory anymore. So when it comes time to actually use your memory, it's kind of scary and stressful, and you're not sure if you'll be able to remember it. So what I provide for people are techniques that help remove that stress. And you can have the confidence in your memory to know that whatever comes your way, if you want to, you can keep it locked in your memory and access it whenever you want, which allows you to worry about other things that may be more important,
I've had a really great ability to learn my whole life, but never really, I wouldn't really chalk it up to memory, and I've never been able to articulate it very well, and I'm still not able to. And so to give you an example, when I was in my early 20s, I did a lot of work in theater, and we had a show got canceled, and I had to learn a solo show. It was about a 25-minute show, and I had basically 48 hours to learn this solo show, and I learned it, no problem. And it was just kind of uncanny. I'm not an actor by trade, but I worked with other actors, and they'd always get so irritated how quickly I could learn lines. But the thing is, I wouldn't really learn them in a normal way, and I had like these little tricks for myself. They call it going off book when you're in theater. How long did it take you to go off book? Are you off book yet? This is a thing that actors talk about, and I would go off book almost immediately. I would kind of refuse the book, and that was kind of my process. But all the memory people I've worked with, they're always training me to use visual associations. So, L is for Lucy, and Lucy is lemons, and lemons are in the kitchen, these kind of things. None of those visual cues ever worked for me. And I'm just curious, those are the ones that I know work for a lot of people. Are there other ones that maybe I should experiment with? Again, I've never been able to really define what I do, except really put a bunch of pressure on myself, and also I'm really heavy auditory guy, so I have to, articulate the sounds and enunciate and open my mouth, and without saying a name, for example, I can't learn it. So when I'm learning names, I literally look at somebody, and as they're walking away, I'll say Julie, 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 Julie from Ireland, or whatever it is, But what other things besides just these sort of, I know people will use, you're walking into a mansion, you look to the right, and on the right there's a plant, and the plant is Peter, and these kinds of things. For some reason, it just doesn't click with me at all.
To be honest, that's those kind of techniques, the association, using the memory palace, are what these memory athletes, and me included, use to be able to do kind of the unthinkable memory feats that you hear about. But I understand that some people don't quite latch onto that easily, but I do think it is trainable. And over the long run, you probably see the benefits of it versus what you currently do. But that's not to say that's the only way to learn and get something into your memory. I think kind of maybe what played on your end and maybe what you're used to, and this is the way you study, is a big part of memory is purpose and intent. And if you have that, and you said you were under pressure and maybe you really felt like into this and you were somewhat enjoying it. Maybe it was stressful, but you enjoyed it. That makes a huge difference in terms of what your memory is capable of. If you think of the most boring thing in the world and you have to memorize it, it's probably going to be very difficult. But if it's something you're interested in and you go into it and that is your main focus, that's going to do wonders for your memory from the start. You may not even need memory techniques, but memory techniques would be the icing on the cake to kind of help it glide in there, But yeah, I think the intent part is super important because that feeds into our daily lives nowadays where we don't pay attention and we don't have the focus on the task at hand because we're thinking about a million other things. We've got to check our email again. We got to look at our phone. But if you sit down and focus on something, you'd be surprised what your memory can do.
So let's talk people through this basic concept of a memory palace or a memory house. And if I'm not mistaken, you've memorized over 200 people's names in one go. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's a pretty common. I've done it on paper in competitions, over 200 names, and then in live audiences, I schmooze around before the show and kind of meet up to 100, 150 people, and then I rattle them off one by one at the beginning of my show.
So I know it's more than we could go into here, but just give us a general principle so at least people can kind of start thinking about this from a trainable practice kind of perspective.
Yeah, so there's two sides to it. One is, we're trying to take information and make it interesting, right? Kind of playing on what I said before. It's easier to memorize if it's something that you're interested in. A lot of information that we have to deal with is not that interesting. And by interesting, I don't mean like, oh, you don't want to know it. I just mean like your brain isn't naturally glued to it. Yeah, or it's complex, right? Maybe it's symbols or numbers or a foreign word, right? The easiest kind of information would be a simple noun word that right? If I say elephant, that's easy to think of, right? But if it's like some weird Arabic word you've never heard of, that might be really difficult to hold in your brain because you've never heard it. You have no associations to it. So the goal is always to find a way to turn that information into something you can picture that associates to something that's familiar to you, so you can make sense of it. So a good example is when you meet someone and you learn their name, you try to come up with a picture for their name, something it reminds you of or sounds like. Nelson, for example, might remind you of what?
Willie Nelson, something like this.
Willie Nelson, perfect. Yeah. So you can now have a picture of that guy with his gray hair, ponytail, playing the guitar, right, with a twang, and that's your picture, right? And that can almost do a lot for yourself already for your memory. But the common problem is, memory is about storage. Where are you storing these memories and how are you accessing them, right? Because, you may have memorized that my name is Nelson using the Willie Nelson picture.
Yeah.
But then let's say a week later you see me, you forget, right? You're like, I can't remember your name. And I maybe, if I cue you enough, you might be able to get it. Or if I say, it was Nelson, you're like, that's right. There's a familiarity there. That means you did remember it. It's somewhere in your brain. The problem is you couldn't connect the dots, right? You couldn't get the access to it. And so the memory palace is where that retrieval part is much better structured. So you put the information, these pictures, in a place where you know exactly where it is in your mind so you can retrieve it later. And there's none of that forgetting, right? So the way it works is you choose a memory palace. It doesn't have to be a palace, but any kind of house or structure or place, a spatial location, and you choose a path through it that makes sense. And you place the images along anchors or positions along the way. And the idea is that when you want to retrieve the information, you just mentally walk back through that same path and pick up what you left there. And they should be there because it sounds like a lot of work, extra work, but it's actually taking advantage of what our brains are just naturally good at.
Yeah, that makes a lot more sense when you explain it that way. One of the things that I do, which as you're explaining, I suddenly have a kind of a reason why, is I always assign. I work internationally, so most of the people I meet are from places I'm not from, and so I always assign a geo to somebody. So it's Lucy from Ireland, or it's Hans from Amsterdam, or whatever it is, and like a person without a geo attached to him, for me, doesn't exist. And I think that sort of that meaning, that reason why, is exactly what you're
Yeah.
talking about, because I'm intrinsically interested in every single country. And so as soon as I attach a country to someone, I have questions for them. I'm interested in their culture, and so immediately this random person who I've just been introduced to at a meeting or a party or whatever it is, suddenly there is actual intrigue there, none other than the fact that they're suddenly attached to a country that I want to know something about.
Yeah, I mean, you're hitting it right on the head. It's what happens is, you have an image for a thing that you want to remember. If you just thought of it, right, that thought is just floating in your mind somewhere. It's hard to pinpoint where it is. But if you suddenly attach that to something that's already firmly planted in your brain, for example, the locations that you know around the world because you're a well-traveled guy. And for me, the memory palaces, which are usually places that I know very well. You're suddenly giving those floating thoughts, those new memories, a home, right? Attached to something firmly planted that's already part of who you are and what you know.
And so you've done a lot of stuff with Alzheimer's. I believe there's a story with your grandmother, if I'm not mistaken. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. So it was my father's mother, who's French, and she lived in just outside of Paris, and we'd only see her maybe once or twice a year. And this was in the early 2000s to mid 2000s, where she started to kind of get cognitively worse. And she was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and in her last few years, it was really drastic changes every time I saw her, seeing her become a shell of herself. And to me, it was such a shock. It was fascinating to watch in a way because you see someone that you love and who loves you and this whole family that's around her, and she's kind of, she loses kind of the essence of who she is. It's this disease that's taking that from her. So when it finally, she passed away in 2009, I was like, I do not want that to happen to me, not only for my sake, but for the family that's around me, because it's horrible. I feel like as a species and as in culture, like memory is everything. It's who we are. It makes us, as humans, and without that, I feel like it's so sad and tragic. So that kind of inspired me to research memory, and that's when I stumbled upon techniques and championships.
And we've had a bunch of people on the show in the past who are dealing with Alzheimer's from a nutrition and lifestyle perspective, but we haven't had anyone talk about the actual mental training aspect, which I know is a huge thing. Just, people doing crossword puzzles and Sudoku and these kinds of things. And so can you speak to that a little bit? Because we haven't had anyone talk about that. And I know that is certainly a factor in keeping your cognitive capacities going, learning new languages, keeping your mind active as in the later years.
Exactly. Yeah. I always like to think to put this example forth. Like if there was a version of me who had never stumbled upon memory techniques, and then there's me who is the 4-time memory champ, and we look at each other at 80 years old, where maybe we're supposed to get Alzheimer's, right? I feel like the guy who's trained his memory, if he's destined to get Alzheimer's anyways, it would have been pushed back a little more, because now I have a bit more, mental agility to kind of dodge some of the early signs. I have techniques or a whole tool bag of tricks and support to help my failing mind at that age. In terms of studies, I had this conversation with someone yesterday that there are studies that showed kind of definitively that making your brain exercise will prevent Alzheimer's. But I've also seen things that kind of say it's not for sure, but I've never seen studies that say it definitely doesn't work. So that's a good thing. One of the neuroscientists that I did some research with a few years ago claimed that people who train their memories or work on Sudoku puzzles or do some kind of mental flexing on a regular basis, going to the mental gym, so to speak, have larger than average hippocampus, which are the part of the brain that is dealing with memory. And people with larger hippocampus don't get Alzheimer's. Or I guess it takes longer for them to get Alzheimer's. You might be dead before your brain would get Alzheimer's, So he was encouraging people, just do these mental exercises every day, make your hippocampus strong and beefy, as if it were a muscle that you can work on every day. and you're helping your chances there of staving off Alzheimer's.
From what I understand, you've done a whole bunch of extreme mountaineering, been on Everest a few times. Is there a connection between these two things? Is that sort of discipline? Does it carry over, or how do you see these three different worlds that you've lived in? This memory, this Alzheimer's work that you've done, and the mountaineering.
Yeah, I've found a way to tie it all together. The nonprofit you mentioned at the beginning is called Climb for Memory. It's something I started a number of years ago, where I wanted to raise awareness for Alzheimer's, and I thought climbing mountains would be a great way to do that, to get some attention, because people are always naturally fascinated by mountains. So if it can kind of divert their attention to that and then talk about Alzheimer's and brain health, I figure that might be a nice tactic. But it's interesting because at first you might think memory and mountain climbing, what on earth would they have to do with each other? But they're both incredibly mental sports, especially high altitude mountaineering. It's slow, it's painful, it's cold. Often your success is based on how well you can stay focused and kind of mentally power through. And those are things that I train every day when I'm memorizing a deck of cards or 1,000 numbers in a session. I have to focus. I can't stray at all. And it's a great practice. It's almost like meditation. It's a great practice of just being able to block out everything and just hone in on the one thing that matters.
What was when you were up on Everest, were there some pretty scary times? Did you see people die? Was it a harrowing experience, or did you get lucky?
So I've been up Everest 3 times. Each has been kind of their own unique experience. And I've had to step over dead bodies, some that have been there for years, some that were just from the night before. I've had my close calls too, but I think I'm always very conscious of there, and I think I make smart decisions, which is why I'm here and I have all my fingers and toes. But it's definitely an experience. It makes you really feel alive.
For people listening we've kind of piqued their interest talking about memory. Obviously we'll send people to check out your book and check out your site, but what kind of ask would you have of people? Meaning, just to challenge somebody who, again, for 20 years has been telling people they're bad with names, for somebody who literally doesn't remember their nieces and nephews' names, and these kinds of things. What kind of challenge would you put forth to someone just to kind of break that belief system and perhaps open up the doors to a new world where, phone numbers and names and things kind of flow freely?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it starts with maybe just hearing a story like mine where I never had a good memory, and here I am, right? I'm telling you that this works, and you can watch my YouTube videos, you can read my book, you can read other memory athletes' books, and you'll find the same story. And so there's really no excuse why anyone should have a bad memory. What's holding people back, I think, often is the misconception that they have a bad memory and that they're stuck with it. So if people can kind of question that, I think, like, hey, maybe I can have a good memory if I, first of all, try, pay attention, and then secondly, if I add some techniques to that, which are pretty simple to learn, then maybe I can too have a good memory. Maybe not a championship memory, but something that will help me remember names and everyday things that I typically have to write down or put on my phone. So I think the first challenge is to kind of accept that you can, I'm talking to the listeners, have a good memory, no matter how bad you think you have a bad memory. And then secondly, I challenge you to try, right? It's too easy to put a phone number in your phone immediately, or to write down a grocery list, but try to memorize it. I know it takes a bit more time, but you're working on your memory, which is a muscle. And then secondly, you're potentially helping grow your hippocampus, which could help you down the line.
Do you feel like there's any kind of limitation in terms of what we can memorize? And by that I mean, some people will selectively decide, I'm not going to learn a phone number. For example, right now I know 2 telephone numbers, and they're both mine. I know my U.S. number and my Spain telephone number, and I haven't done this deliberately. I just don't know anybody's telephone number, but I do know people who say, I'm saving my memory for ... Is there anything to suggest that we have a finite number of things we can remember, whether it's countries or numbers or presidents in order or anything like this?
My personal opinion is no. And I say this because, I've been in the competitive memory world for over 10 years now, and I've seen, what was considered the limit, a number of years ago. And, 10 years later, it's completely shattered. the amount of information people have been able to put in their head. And, people just get smarter and smarter on how to put that stuff in your brain. So I really don't think there's a limit, at least something that's feasible for us to understand. I think it's to a point. There probably is some limit, but for us, we can imagine it's so big that it's almost infinite.
And let me ask you this. When you're training for a memory competition, do you save your memory for the important stuff? Like, is there a way that you clear your brain? Like, are you sparing cognitive load, or is it the opposite?
No, not at all. That's an interesting question. Do I save space? No, because you think, okay, maybe I ran out of memory palaces, right?
Right. Your palace is
because that's what I need to store the information, right?
Yeah.
My palaces are full, which could happen because I put stuff in there, but you can always create more palaces. And you might be thinking, well, don't you run out of houses or locations? Well, think about this. I mean, a memory palace can be life size, right? Like your actual size of you walking through an apartment, or it could even be on a miniature scale, right? You could take a single desk and make a huge memory palace out of it, right? Just imagining you're the size of an ant and looking at every single crack and corner. There's a German memory competitor who claims you can always teach someone how to memorize the U.S. presidents on a bar of soap.
Oh, wow.
Which sounds ridiculous, but he's playing off of what I just said, is you can find the smallest thing with enough detail and turn that into a memory palace,
Well, Nelson, you've got me reignited in terms of improving my memory, and so I appreciate you coming on this show, and I'm excited. I know a lot of our listeners struggle with this issue, especially people who are a little bit older, and again, a lot of people chalk it up to old age, and I think a lot of it just has to do with the fact that we stop trying. At least for me, I have a much, much sharper memory than I did when I was younger, just because when I was a kid, I was a little bit lazy, and I'm not at all now. So for people listening, where should we send them? What are you up to? What's the best place for them to go online?
Yeah, nelsondellis.com is my website. They can reach out to me if they want to learn more or potentially have me coach them. Also, my YouTube channel, you can just search for me, Nelson Dellis, there. I have a bunch of videos on little tips here and there on memory hacks and practical applications for how to use your memory in everyday life.
And do you go to Las Vegas and count cards and make a bunch of money?
No comment.
Nelson, thanks so much for coming on the show. Let's keep in touch for the future. One of the most common trouble areas for yoga students is their hips. People complain about tight hips and tight hamstrings probably more than any other spot on their body. The reason our hips are so tight in Western culture is because we never sit on the floor. We almost never squat down. In fact, our range of motion in terms of our hip flexion and extension is so shockingly limited that by the time most people are in their 20s, they can't really sit on the floor cross-legged comfortably. Their back's all hunched up and their knees are way up off the ground. And this affects all kinds of things. It affects your standing posture, your running gait, of course, your ability to do yoga. Probably half the poses in yoga demand a certain degree of hip mobility. And it also leaves you susceptible to injuries. If you have dysfunctional movement patterns, if your posture is wonky, you can't really lift weight up off the ground. You can't really move like a fully functional human. So it's really important to open up your hips. It just feels great also. You're more comfortable when you travel. You can get through yoga classes more comfortably. You'll also find all different movement practices, whether you're weightlifting in the gym, out for a run, or just doing anything that you might like to do for fun, like skateboarding or surfing or whatever it is just easier when your hips are open. A lot of people don't even realize how blocked they are. I get a lot of questions. We teach a pose called Blaster in our Gravity Yoga series that's very popular. In any case, a lot of people want to come take my classes. I usually just teach training courses these days, so I'm not that accessible, which is a shame. I'd like to do more public classes, but I'm traveling, I'm teaching, I'm writing, I'm doing these podcasts, and I don't have much time. In an attempt to make myself more accessible and to connect with my listeners, I'm doing a 21-day hip opening challenge. It's a private program. It's available on Instagram in a private group. It's really simple. I know you already have Instagram. You just sign up for the program, you join through the app, and every day you'll practice with me live on video. I will share with you my best hip opening stretches. I'll answer questions. We'll talk about anatomy. I'll show you some bones and some anatomical stuff to think about and show you how to do gravity yoga breathing and practices to really open up your hips. Now, in 21 days, the question is, can I really make progress? And the answer is absolutely. You'll make huge, huge progress. But even more importantly, you'll set the stage for some really massive transformations. When it comes to mobility, usually about 80% of the gains you'll ever make are made in the first year, and usually about half of those gains are made in the first month. So it's really, really big gains. You'll notice it right away. and it's pretty fun as well. Hip opening poses are really intense and very rewarding as well. I usually do it right before bed or in the evening because the breathing that we do with gravity yoga tends to put you to sleep. In any case, to learn more, go to yogabody.com. Scroll down, you'll see upcoming courses, the 21-day hip opening challenge. I hope you can join me. This week's nutritional tip is in response to a listener question. Listener Taylor says, "Hey Lucas, what do you think of sous vide cooking? Is it safe to cook in plastic?" For those of you who don't know, sous vide is this method of slow cooking that's used by home chefs, but also some really high-level, even Michelin star-level chefs to prepare lots of different foods, but meat is the one that people get most excited about. So what someone might do is take an expensive cut of meat, brown the outside, just barely cook it on a pan, toss it in this plastic bag, you heard right, a plastic bag, throw that plastic bag in a pot of water, carefully control the temperature, and cook the thing really, really slowly, like for hours. What are the advantages? Well, you keep all the moisture in, and you can have kind of edge-to-edge rare steaks, which people are into apparently, and that's why they get really excited about it. You know, one of the more common things is somebody will have a barbecue, they'll buy a really expensive piece of meat, they'll throw it in the barbecue, and the thing comes out looking like a charred piece of charcoal. And so this is something that people like. Low temperature cooking, of course, is a great idea. You preserve a lot of heat-sensitive nutrients, of which there are dozens. Everything from vitamins to enzymes to the bioavailability of even macronutrients are affected by heat, so it can be a good way to go. Personally, I know these sous vide bags in theory don't leach plastics. I just don't believe it. I don't think it's a great idea to cook in plastic. I don't think it's a great idea to cook in aluminum. I just don't want to eat foods that are made in plastic or aluminum. So for me, I'm staying away. The amount of plastics that we know about, there's dozens of different plastics. And so the big offenders, right, the big offenders that leach xenoestrogens into foods and into your water, those are regulated. But we don't know what these other plastics do. And I just, the visual reaction from everyone who sees a piece of food cooking in a plastic bag is not positive. And I think we need to trust our intuition. That just looks like a bag of Uncle Ben's instant rice to me. And it doesn't look like gourmet food. So personally, I don't eat it. In theory, it should be a good way to go. I would encourage you to think about something like a crock pot instead. I know you can't have dried foods, they end up becoming stewed, but you get the same effect without cooking in plastic. Hope that's helpful. This week's listener question is from Reese. Reese says, "I've been suffering from dermatitis on my eyelids for the better part of last year. I've tried lotions, potions, topical hydrocortisones, and an elimination diet, and even acupuncture in an attempt to heal this, but nothing seems to work. I recently stumbled on the work of Andreas Moritz, particularly the fantastic liver and gallbladder flush and its benefits for skin conditions, among other things. Do you know about this? Is it safe? I'm generally in good health apart from the skin condition. Should I give this a try?" So Reese, I used to work in cleansing centers. That's kind of how I got my start before yoga even. And I spent, during my early yoga years, I still worked in cleansing centers in Thailand and in Bangkok. And I have tons of experience working with people on these programs, and I've done a bunch of these myself. Some of these programs I feel are a little bit predatory, and they prey on this idea that we are sinners, that we've done something wrong, that our body is toxic, and that's something we need to remove the toxins so we can come back to health. We need to be, baptized in health. And I'm using this religious analogy deliberately because it's sold very often in the context of religion. It's sold very often with the language of religion, and the fact that you ate Pringles all through your teenage years, or you used to swallow your bubble gum, or you had a drinking problem for 10 years, or whatever it is, that doesn't necessarily mean that your body is damaged or that anything's wrong. There might be. And you know what? On the flip side, you might be a collegiate athlete and you might do everything right, and there might be something wrong with you too. And one of the most damaging things I found about these cleansing centers was not the adverse physical effects, because there weren't that many. Most of these things are relatively safe, but the adverse psychological effects of people who would get on this endless wheel of trying to fix what's broken inside them, when sometimes there just wasn't anything to be found. Now, that's easy for me to say. You've got eyelids that are causing you problems, and I certainly relate to that. I've had challenges with skin in my life, acne and other things, and a ton of people who end up on the health path, the yoga path, listeners of this show, have come to the health path, health journey because of skin conditions. It can just be so frustrating. It can just make you feel terrible, whether it's eczema or dermatitis or acne or whatever it is. And sometimes, unfortunately, there's really phantom causes. So what could be causing this? I'm not a dermatologist and I don't know that much about this condition, but from all the people I've worked with, like you said, all the things you're looking at, elimination diet, skincare products, the only other thing that I would encourage you to take a look at, I'm guessing you have, but that's, mental and emotional stress. And that that trigger can manifest in all kinds of different ways for different people. The more common ones are weight gain and sleep problems, but some people have totally different reactions. Some people totally have a skin condition. So I would encourage you to really keep asking 7 questions deep. When did this start? What was going on? When did this start? What was going on? Think of it like diagnosing a software problem where, one day your computer's working, the next day it's not. What changed, right? What happened? Oh, I installed that weird little multiplayer game and suddenly my computer is all locked up and has no bandwidth or whatever it is. Try to figure out, when it started. If there was any kind of trigger, maybe you just moved home, maybe there was a loss in the family. If you can trace it back, there might be something there. And I might be stretching here. Maybe you're saying, hey, Lucas, I've looked at all this stuff. And so apart from that, should you do a gallbladder cleanse? I've done these. Typical routine for a gallbladder cleanse. I don't know about Andreas's protocol, but it's probably something similar. You go on calorie restriction for a number of days, usually about 5 days, and on the last day you drink a walloping dose of olive oil and lemon juice. So like the way I used to do it is I drink juices for 5 days, and I drink maybe a liter of juice every day, so very calorie restricted for 5 days, and on the last day I drink 250 milliliters of olive oil with lemon juice. And what happens is when you've been fat-free for 5 days, meaning not eating any fat, and then suddenly you flood your system with more fat than you would normally eat in a day, your gallbladder, which stores bile, and your liver just go, whoa, to try to digest that and move that stuff through. And so they dump all the bile that they have in an attempt to digest that fat. The result is you usually get a low fever, and you are often shaking, and you don't sleep, and you feel terrible. You end up hugging the toilet all night. Some people vomit. Everyone has some sort of disaster pants. And this kind of purge for a lot of people is mostly psychological. People will post photos online of things that they quote unquote passed in these gallstones, but it's really just congealed fat. You just drank a whole glass full of olive oil that's going to come out the other end looking pretty weird. Though anecdotally, though, you will find people have had really great results. People also get really great results going out into the desert and taking ayahuasca and tripping out, and they wake up the next day and they feel like a new person. So I don't want to say that there's not anything to it. Medically, I certainly can't find any reason. But sometimes, putting your body under intense stress can be beneficial, right? Sometimes, whatever it is, sometimes the person pushing their boundaries and running an ultra marathon or these kinds of things, which might even be unhealthy in the short term, somehow they have this positive rebound effect, this eustress effect where it's a positive stress in the long term. Personally, I don't do them anymore. I don't recommend them anymore. I've seen a lot of negative results, but I wouldn't be afraid of them. It sounds like you're in good health. I would just be aware that this will be an unpleasant evening as you toss and turn and sweat and run to the bathroom. Good luck, and let us know if you find any other new information.
This week's iTunes review is by Rihanna702 from the USA. Rihanna702 says, I've been listening to every podcast for the past couple of years. I learn something new with each episode. Lucas and his guests talk about a diverse range of health topics. I love the Q&A portion of the podcast too. Not sure if the podcast name change means the podcast will change too, but I hope not. It's my #1 podcast, and I recommend it to others that are into wellness too. Rihanna702, you have won the Yoga Trapeze. Email us at podcast@yogabody.com and we will ship it to you.
I recently led a 6-week podcast startup bootcamp. It was a coaching program designed to take people from concept, from zero, all the way to published podcast, published show. I'd like to share 4 of those shows with you today. The first one is called A Life Well Lived with Bill Fleenor. The next one is called Beauty Detangled with Paula Davis. Taming Aunt Flo with Sarah Yingling. Compassion as My Compass with Ariel Zachow. I will link up to all 4 of these shows in the show notes. If you go to yogabody.com and scroll down, you'll see the show notes right there on the homepage. I'll also link up to them on our Instagram account, which is @yogabody, and I'll link up in the stories so you can find them really quickly. Congratulations to these 4 students. We have a bunch more shows that'll be published in the weeks to come. It was a really great program. I know the next question you'll be asking is, when can I join the program? I don't think I'm going to hold another one until 2020, but if you're interested, go to yogateacherscollege.com/calendar and you can see what else we're working on. Congratulations to these new podcasts, and I'd encourage all of you to check them out.